Aloha, my name is Julie Mitchell, and I am the Executive Director here at Ikahi Mediation Center. Welcome to our Finding Solutions Growing Peace Brown Bag Lunch series. Ikahi is a nonprofit community mediation center serving East Hawaii, and we are one of 5 in the state. And I see mediators and folks from the other mediation centers on the screen, so welcome. We started out back in 1983, so 39 years ago. We were a program of the Island of Hawaii YMCA, and in 2006, we became our own independent nonprofit organization. We empower people to come together, to talk and to listen, to explore options and to find their own best solutions. And to achieve this mission, we offer mediation, facilitation, and training like this one today, to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. And this Brown Bag Lunch series is held every third Thursday at 12 noon on Zoom. And you just need to register each time on Eventbrite to get the link. So thank you very much for being here. I do want to let you know about 2 exciting events that we have coming up. Let me see if I can share my screen and share those with you. Hold on a second. Where is it? First one is a training that's coming up with Sylvia Dolina, and it's called, hold on, I'm going to put a little note in the chat while I speak to you at the same time, which is always difficult to do all these things at once. Hold on a second to manage everyone. Okay, let me get people in from the waiting room as well. Oh, Sylvia's coming on right now. How wonderful. So she is going to be teaching this workshop called Boundless Confidence, What I Bring to the World. It is coming up on Thursday, July 7th. It's a day-long workshop over at Hilo. And please take a look at this if you're interested. It's $50 for a full-day workshop, or if you happen to work at Hilo, it's free to you as a part of your professional development opportunities. And what we're going to be looking at here is gaining tools that help you tap into your innate abilities and knowledge to show up as the best you, think on your feet, decide what kind of energy you bring to the table, and step into the new person that you want to be. So please take a look at that if you'd like to register. The other event that we're coming up is one of my favorite events, and we have not been able to have this one for 2+ very long COVID years. This is our fundraiser. It's the Hilo Orchid Show Gala preview party. We do it on the evening of Thursday, July 28th. It's from 6 to 9 over at Edith Kanakaole Stadium. We give you a wine glass, we give you a beer glass, and you can go around and do tasting. We have delicious catered food, we have music. And if you love orchids, you get the very first chance to see them and to buy them because the vendors are there that night. And there's also a silent auction that benefits the Hilo Orchid Society. So I put links to both of those events, the workshop, Boundless Confidence with Sylvia Dolina, who's on today's Zoom, I just saw come on, and our fundraiser next month. So if you want to check those out, please do. Let me stop my share and get on with our event today. So we will be at the end of this asking you if you will please fill out a short online survey. It helps us with our grant funding for this event. And I'll put that link in there at the end. If you could just click in on it and fill it out right away before you go anywhere, that would help us out greatly. And then I also will send later an email with the slides, the video link, and again, another link to that evaluation form, because occasionally we've had people tell us they can't get it from the link that we post in the chat. And if you like this brown bag, we invite you to our next one. The topic on July 21st will be Tim Hansen speaking on the topic Indigenous Dispute Resolution Practices from around the world. And again, I will put the link to register for that in the chat. So now you have links to register for many things. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce our topic and speakers. Today we are speaking about finding Pilina, effective communication through relationship building. Our guests are Troy Andrade, Charles Crumpton, and Elizabeth Kent. Troy is a law professor and director of the Ulu Lehua Scholars Program at the William S. Richardson School of Law at UH Manoa. Charles Crumpton was a civil litigation attorney from 1978 to 2014, and since 1985 is a mediator and arbitrator who teaches collaborative leadership and conflict resolution. And Elizabeth Kent formerly practiced commercial law and currently is a mediator and meeting facilitator who also teaches conflict resolution. Welcome, and please take it away.
Okay, thanks much, Julie. And welcome all of you. I see some longtime friends, Annie Smoke, Ben Carroll, Katie Rennie, and others, and some new faces, and all very welcome. So a couple of thoughts to start all of us off with today. We all understand the importance of relationship building and relationship healing in the work that we do, whether it's mediation, arbitration, conflict resolution, or any other form of work that involves relating with people. So the first thought is we're going to kind of flip expectations a little bit and think about the wisdom of youth and the curiosity of the elders, the ku'upuna. And the second thought is kind of an adage that individually we can survive, but together we can thrive. Troy, today's topic, finding Pilina. Tell us a little bit about the origins, the meaning, and the value of Pilina from what your understanding may be.
Sure, thanks, Chuck, and thank you to Julie and Ikahi Mediation Center and everyone for being here today. Pilina is obviously a Hawaiian word, and Mary Kavenapukui, who basically wrote the Hawaiian language dictionary, kind of defines Pilina as this strong relationship that's based on, I believe what she says is mutual respect and understanding. Pilina is really that connection that ties people together on a deeper level. When I think about Pilina and sort of its origins, I can't help but think about Hawaiian relationships, Native Hawaiian relationships that they had with each other and with the land in particular, right? So this concept of Pilina is not just a relationship between individuals, but it's also a relationship that you have with the environment as well, and with spiritual beings. It sort of encompasses all of these aspects that really need to be present in order to ensure that a community, I think, can move forward. So as a quick example, if it's okay, Chuck, and I'm a Hawaiian legal historian, so I apologize. We're going to get a little bit of Hawaiian history here. Prior to Western contact, there was a social stratification of classes here in Hawaii. So you had sort of the ali'i, the akua, who are the gods and goddesses. You had the ali'i class, who were sort of the physical manifestations of the gods and goddesses. And then you had the maka'ainana, sort of the commoners. There was this pilina, this relationship between the commoners and the ali'i class, the chiefs. This pilina was so much so that while some people may have called the system, we had a feudal system, right? And you think of feudal system, you think of maybe England and, you know, the ways in which the higher echelon of society treated the lower echelon of society. Here in Hawaii, there was a pilina between the two classes such that there was an obligation of the chiefs to take care of the people. And reciprocally, there was an obligation of the people to take care of the chiefs. Right? If the people did not have strong pilina with the chiefs, the people could pick up and move and go find another chief, right? That would care for them in the way that they wanted to be cared for. Similarly, if the people were not, they did not have that pilina with the ali'i, they would not be a productive community, right? Which would then affect society as a whole. So when I think of pilina, I think of that mutual respect and understanding and mutual reciprocal relationship that comes back from sort of deep connectedness between groups, or in this context of mediations or arbitration sort of between parties. So Chuck, sorry, that was my long-winded answer to origins of Pilina.
Oh, and when we think about it, that's actually a very succinct way to put it. People could talk or write books at great length and go into a lot more detail. So Elizabeth, how does that factor into and connect with what you do and how you see your role and your value?
So it's interesting, as I was thinking about this and in doing my preparation, I thought that what I talk about is I've had the opportunity to work with both of you, not all three of us together, but with both of you. And so I thought about it in terms of working with somebody. And for me, working with somebody else, it's a really good thing. It's also a bit of a challenge because I find parts of me, I tend to be a loner. And I also know that when I'm working on projects, cases, which I've worked on with both of you, I think that there's always a better result for the parties if there's two of us. And so working with someone presents challenges that you don't have when you're working on your own. So that's what I was thinking about as I was focusing on what Pilina meant to me. So it's how do I overcome some of the challenges that working with somebody else can bring? And I think that relates to the parties as well as they think about their relationships. But how about you, Chuck? What was going to be your approach?
I think one of the things that brought it to mind that connects exactly with what you and Troy have just said is Civil Beat has come out with a new program or project, and they call it Ulana Pilina. Ulana meaning to weave. And what I love about that is it brings in the multi-person aspects of it, the multifaceted aspects of it, but also brings in and emphasizes that this is an art. It's a part of our culture. It's part of who we are. And sharing that part of who we are is an integral part of weaving those relationships. So Troy, in your work, you're dealing with students, you're dealing with other academics, you're dealing with the community. How do the approaches change with each of these groups, or are there common elements?
That's a really great question. I think as an educator, and I teach at the law school, right? So I'm getting sort of the cream of the crop. You would consider sort of the cream of the crop students who have gone through high school, been successful in college, made their way through the LSAT and the application process, and are now at law school. So, by the time they come to us at law school, they can read, they can write, they can communicate generally pretty effectively. One of the interesting things is the classes that I teach can be the topics can create some emotional reactions, right? And strong emotional reactions from students. And so what I always do at the beginning of the semester, I get to this point, to build Pilina, is I do these really corny exercises with students. And so on the first day, and this one's actually not a corny exercise, but I asked the students to come in and instead of introducing themselves, because they can do that in orientation, right? Instead of introducing themselves, I asked them to introduce their grandmother or sort of a grandmother figure, right? What that does, I think, is it allows them to tell their story of their grandma. And I think most people have really great stories and memories of a grandmother figure in their life. And so it can sometimes get emotional for students. So you see the vulnerability of these students. You see that all our grandmas went through a lot to get to where they were and to get to sort of our generations, right? What that does, I think, is it starts to build that Pilina, right? So we see you not as the person sitting here, but we see you as well as your grandma sitting behind you, right? And with everybody's grandma in the space, it somehow creates this classroom where people feel comfortable talking about some of these issues without getting personal and without personally attacking other people, which I have found to be really powerful in creating spaces where we can talk about issues, really hot button legal issues that our community is currently struggling with. And then the corny exercises is every day after that, at the beginning of class, I would do just a quick, tell me your favorite candy bar really quickly around the class. Tell me your favorite Disney movie. That one can get a little bit confrontational sometimes. Your favorite Disney movie, who would have thought? But what it does is it builds Pilina, right? In the sense that, hey, I like Twix just as much as that person. I'm going to remember that that person likes Twix, right? Because that's what I like. Hey, I love the movie Little Mermaid, right? I know that that person likes the movie Little Mermaid too, right? It creates something more than just what you see, what you would expect in a classroom. And I have found that it has worked to really bring students closer together and creates space in the classroom for more open and frank dialogue in a safe space. In terms of outside of the classroom, that's a little bit harder to do, right? I think these types of activities could also be done in facilitated conversations, or, I mean, potentially in mediations as well. I just haven't used it. You know, my space has really just been in the classroom to try to create that Pilina.
So how does that differ if you're working with other groups, other academics, the community?
So I think you would find different ways to do that, right? It might not be the beauty of being a law professor, right, is you get to stand in the front of the room and tell people what to do. As a, you know, if you're in a meeting with faculty, you know, with my colleagues, right, those conversations can happen outside of sort of the formal meeting spaces. And so one thing that I did when I was at the McCorston firm, and then when I left the McCorston firm to come to the law school, one of the first things I did was I went out to coffee with all of my colleagues, right? Just as a, hey, I want you to know who I am. You know, most of you were my law professors, but I want to know you as a law professor, as a colleague, right? Not just as the person who taught me civil procedure or evidence. And I found that to be helpful in, you know, in building that Pilina, in the sense that I was coming with very different ideas on how I think students should be learning the law. And some of my colleagues have been teaching for decades and haven't changed their pedagogy in decades, which is not a bad thing, right? But I just had different ideas. And so coming in and sharing those thoughts with people built more sort of mutual understanding and respect, I think. Oh, Chuck, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Hey, thanks. Elizabeth, in your work, in your activities, do you also elicit personal communications and connections? And how might that differ from what Troy has just described?
Yeah, I find that those, so the answer is sometimes. It really depends on the case. I think I went to a great training with Nina Meyerdine, and she said the correct answer 99% of the time is it depends. So it depends. And you really have to get a sense of the case. But the thing I want to underscore from what Troy said, that I'm always trying to build in myself and in the people I'm working with, is an intentional curiosity. And that's what I think when he had those coffee hours, he was curious about the person. And so when you get there, you assess the situation. In some cases, you work with people, parties, who really don't want to talk about the personal, and the personal feels too touchy-feely to them. They're going to turn off if you start to talk about the personal. And other people, they want to go back and talk about their grandmas. They want to talk about, when I was starting out, we used to do, tell us about your name, which was a really nice icebreaker until you've done it about 15 times. Then it's not quite as new or interesting. But I think people are looking for a connection sometimes, but not all of the time. And so that's something important to realize. Some of the time, all they want is a resolution and let's get out of here because I have a lot of other things. And I think that's a second thing that I'm imagining took place in those meetings that Troy was having is withholding of judgment. Because if that's what they want, that's fine. You know, I want to be as curious as possible to figure out what it is that they want and that they need, and not to impose what I think is the right way on them. And that's a challenge sometimes, to separate out your own judgments from what people are saying and what you're thinking.
And that's a really important distinction, because we may be in conflict situations where the resolution involves actually ending a relationship, but doing it in a way that the respect and understanding that generated the relationship are honored sufficiently so that the relationship can end in ways that will not continue motivation for more conflict, for more destructive tendencies, attitudes, or behaviors. How might you go about that? Any thoughts, Elizabeth?
It's interesting that you said that, Chuck, because I think one of my most successful cases involved the ending of a relationship. And I think everybody felt comfortable when it got to that point, because they had all seen it the same way. And often I found that I work on a lot of different types of cases, but it comes up often when I'm working on employer-employee types of mediations, where somebody realizes that I've done everything I possibly can here, and the other person has done everything they possibly can, and we don't see that there's going to be a way that we can work together in the way that we want to work together in the future. So I think getting back to the curiosity, in those types of situations and cases where I've seen it, it really helped if people had spent a lot of time having the curious conversation, understanding how the other person saw it, and also going deep inside themselves to do that introspection and to understand themselves. And then if they came to that conclusion, I just felt from talking with them that they had a sense of relief. It wasn't what they had hoped for often when they were going into the cases, but it's what they could live with. I've also seen it, these are broad generalizations, and anytime you make a broad generalization, there's always going to be the case that was different. But I did see it often in the landlord-tenant work that I was doing as well. I think it's harder in family cases because there's so many connections. But I don't do a whole lot of family work. That's just me. In fact, I stay away from it for those reasons. But that's me guessing and going back to things, mediations I did probably 25 years ago with Ben Carroll. I'm done.
And those are critically important points to understand, as Ben indicates, because the resolution may involve terminating a relationship, a legal or business, or sometimes even a personal relationship in some ways between the parties. But it almost always also involves respecting, honoring, and enabling other relationships for each of those parties to go forward, to be available, to have the chance to grow and prosper. So Troy, how do you convey that element of understanding that forward direction and context in the work that you do and the teaching you do?
So again, the classroom space is a little bit different than say a mediation, but I think setting the ground rules up front and being clear with everyone on what the ground rules are in terms of engaging in what in the social studies world they call wicked hard problems, right? That have answers, I mean, right answers on air quote, both sides of the argument, right? And so I think creating that space for this, or intentional curiosity, right? For people to feel comfortable to talk about their legal arguments. And my job as somewhat of a facilitator in the Socratic dialogue with my students is to ensure that what they're saying is always tied back, not to their sort of personal feelings, but to the topic that we're learning, right? The law that we're learning, so that what they're saying is sort of mediated through the readings that we've done for that particular class. Again, which is way easier to do in a classroom than it is in a mediation. But I think it really does start with building that space in the classroom and in that environment to be able to have those conversations.
So Elizabeth, in your work in mediating and conflict resolution, how do you invite and cultivate and nurture and help people to see what a resolution that would give them the best possibilities, the things they most need to go forward, what that might look like, and how to craft a solution that would include the key elements of that?
Okay, is it okay if I answer that in 1 second? Because I want to
Sure.
boomerang off of what Troy said again. It's interesting how many points that we both have in common as we thought about this, Troy. And one of the things I had high in my notes that I wanted to talk about that I think helps Pilina and helps people working together is having clarity in roles. So often problems come up because people aren't clear what their role is. I just had an experience like that recently. And the problems that we had were because we both went into this. There were a number of us who were involved in it, so I shouldn't say both. All of us went into it and we made assumptions about what everybody's role was. And because of course, everybody sees the world the same way I do, I knew that they knew, what their roles were, but they didn't, of course. That's what we found out a week later. And we had to do a lot of scrambling to get there. And so one of the things the three of us had talked about as we were preparing for today was we were talking about different generations. And so lack of clarity can happen between anybody. It could, if I had a twin, it could happen between me and my twin. But I think that it is more likely to happen when people come from a different culture, a different view. So I have an idea of exactly what a law student should be like, which is based on my view of my having been in law school, which is going to be different than Troy's view, because I know Troy is young enough to be my son because his parents and I graduated high school the same year. So things have changed in that time. And so it's important to not make those assumptions and to be really clear about your roles are. So going back to your question, Chuck, how do I work with parties on that? One of the things I really believe is that people have to come up with their own solutions. I can tell them what to think, but they're generally not going to think it. Like, how many times does your doctor tell you stop smoking, you got to lose weight? And you don't do that until you have your health challenge, for instance. So in my style of mediation and facilitation, I want to pose questions. It's really a challenge to make sure that those questions aren't leading questions, because people are really smart and they'll pick up on it. If I said something leading, like, well, don't you think it's going to work out better for you if you have a good relationship? That's me telling them what to do. So I have to figure out in a clever way how to ask questions that get them to be thinking about their what's going to be best for them. And it really has to be non-judgmental. I go back to something that I learned that was so important, was distinguishing between the difference of a judgment and an observation. So I really want to focus on observations as opposed to judgment, not saying something like, well, it's clear that your disagreement is, really not going to get you anywhere, but ask a less judgmental question. Well, you've said that you're here because of your disagreements. What impact is that having on you? Do you see ways to resolve it? So there's a difference between making an observation and a judgment. And that's what I try to do. But Chuck, I'm going to turn it back on you. What do you do?
I think that's a really great way to say it, because one of the things that's come home to me in decades of doing this stuff is we're really trying to help people through respect and understanding to get through conflict as intact as possible. And to do that, they need to understand, what does that look like? What needs to be as intact as possible? What things can be given up, wounded, scarred, diminished, compromised, and what things need to be retained whole or nearly whole. Troy, how does that come up in your teaching work? Or does it?
I'm not sure. What I've been thinking about while, both you and Elizabeth have been talking is this notion of people coming to their own solutions. And so what I do in the classroom, let's say we're talking about, I don't know, how about an issue of the day, abortion. And there are views in the classroom on all sides about the debate. What I think about is, how do I create a space where the conversation is guided? I clearly have my own thoughts about the issue, but it is not my job as a law professor to impose my thoughts on students. So what I will do is I will advocate for all sides as the professor, right? And force students to really defend their positions, and force students to really understand sort of the underlying arguments that they're making, all the case law that we've been reading. And so I do that not to impose sort of views on students, but to get them to think about it so that they can come up with their own ideas about how they would address that particular issue if, say, they were a judge in that particular case. And this is one of the notorious things about law school exams, right? Is that for somebody like me who's grading exams, it's the process that I'm looking for to get to that A paper. It's not the actual answer at the end, right? I don't care what your thoughts are on abortion. I care about the legal arguments and analysis that you're weaving together to get to that solution. And so, not to push back against Elizabeth, but at least in the classroom space, right, there are times where I have to kind of propose all sides of the solution for the students to be able to really think holistically about the arguments. And again, it's just a different context than I think mediations.
Totally different context. So Robert asked, talk more about the difference between judgments and observations. And so this is a judgment. We make them all the time. And I think the point of this is being in touch with when you're making a judgment. Chuck, that's a pretty picture behind you. That's a nice backdrop. That's a judgment. Chuck, you have, because the word was pretty, that's my judgment. Chuck has a backdrop of a harbor in Vietnam. That's an observation. And so knowing when you're making it, once I started, this comes from when I learned about it, Owen Tamamoto is the one who taught me about it. And he was talking about nonviolent communication, which is Marshall Silverberg. And one of the tenets of nonviolent communication is distinguishing between judgments and observations. And so once I heard Owen talk, I started to make a tick mark that day. Every time I said something that I thought was more of a judgment than an observation. And it was just incredible how often I did it. And so I remember talking about this with one of my colleagues, and the colleague said, oh my gosh, now I realize what it is. Every time I'm talking to so-and-so, they say they're making an observation, but what they're really doing is making a judgment. And so I thought that's why that person drives me nuts. And so once you start to be able to distinguish it, it becomes, you realize how often we do it. The traffic is junk. That's a judgment. It took me an hour at rush hour to get home. And if I go when it's non-rush hour, it only takes me 10 minutes. That's an observation. So those are kind of factual things, but taking it out of the factual, something as basic, that's a pretty, this is a nice room. This room, I like this room because it's wider than 15 feet. Once you start to move it to other types of things, then it becomes more of a challenge. And I agree with you, Troy. It's not like I want to be without judgment all the time. I mean, when I'm a grandparent, I have to have some judgment. I'm with a 9-year-old, and I have to decide, no, 10 ice creams is too many ice creams to have, and when I'm a boss and
You gotta
doing
tell
other things.
you gotta tell my grandpa that. My dad.
Really?
Oh.
He gives your kids 10. Yeah, Grandma Urky, that's what they call me, tends to be kind of a disciplinarian. 9 is okay. But anyhow, to try to take it into a different realm and to catch yourself as a neutral is really a challenge. And knowing, again, it's going back to Nina's answer, it depends. Knowing when to be judgmental, when not to, when to do just observations is really the question.
And it may also come back to that really critical intentional curiosity point, because if we can think of a way to raise the issue or address it as a question rather than as a statement, that may help. Because then we're inviting the other person to share perceptions, to share thoughts, to share things that can then be hopefully channeled into constructive understandings that can lead to solution elements. So Troy, in working with the students, what are some of the major obstacles that you run into in communications with students?
So one of the big ones, which Elizabeth touched on a little bit, is, I tend to make assumptions about students too. And as an example, my students can range from around 21 through, I just had a student who graduated who was 73, right? So students can range in age. And I like to think I'm pretty tech savvy. And I, assumed that all of my younger students didn't need additional instructions on how to use tech. And so I, would spend some time with my older students going over tech issues and how to, access certain material and all of that, assuming that my younger students knew that, right? And some of them didn't. And so in terms of communications, for me, I've found that I've had to check my own assumption, and that's just one example, right? But I've had to check my own assumptions about students that are coming into the classroom. So that's just one thought.
So Troy, here's a coming attraction. When you get to be my age, you realize how much you don't know. And that's actually really helpful. and you hear this all the time, that people say I was so much smarter when I was younger, but really what I was oblivious to realizing the limitations that I had, and that my perceptions and my view wasn't shared by everybody.
Yeah, no, and to add on to that, I mean, one of the best advice that I got from one of those coffee hours that I had with my contracts professor, was my colleague, Hazel Bay. She said, if you don't know an answer, just tell them you don't know and you'll get back to them. Right in the middle of class, if you are in a classroom with 80 students and somebody asks you a question, and maybe it's the way they worded the question, or you just don't know the answer, you just tell them you don't know the answer, and you will come back to them the next class with the answer. And I have found that has been so helpful, right? I mean, I was preparing for every class that I taught like I was going to trial, right? Trying to anticipate all of the questions that students would ask of me. And inevitably, there were questions that they would ask that I just, didn't know the answer to at that point. And so the easiest thing was for me to just be honest and say, I don't know, but I will get back to you. That's a great question. I'll get back to you. She also told me, and this again in the context of teaching at a law school, is to tell your students not to give you as the professor hypothetical problems, because there's so many nuances to creating hypos that you could just confuse the whole class if somebody's going off on sort of a little tangent. So words of wisdom from my colleague Hazel Bay.
So Troy, when you encounter that, do you ever throw it out there to the rest of the class? Say, anybody have any thoughts, insights on that?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do. Most times I don't. I generally take the position that if I don't know the answer, I don't want to assume that my students are going to know the answer too. But sometimes I will. And I'll always caveat the response with, hey, that sounds right, but again, let me go back and check, and I will reconfirm for our next class period.
So in those exchanges, Elizabeth, in your work, in your mediation work, one of the things that happens, as much as we'd love to avoid it, is that we may say or imply things that trigger people to reactions that make the communications more difficult. How do you develop an ability to anticipate and minimize that risk?
Oh boy, how do you do? I mean, that is a really good question. One of the other points I had wanted to make was about blind spots, which I think of as another word for triggers. I can answer it better for myself than what I can see in other people, but I'll try to answer it for other people. I mean, you try to listen very, very carefully so that you're hearing from them, and ask open-ended questions so that you pick up from them what might be the difficult areas. But in a sense, for me as a mediator, when something like that happens, this might sound strange, but it's a gift, because anger, I think when I see somebody get angry, I'm not so worried that they're angry. What I want to see is, what made you angry? What is it that's beneath that anger that that is pushing you? What is the anger a reaction to? So in a sense, when people have a reaction like that, it really is a gift. You can get to what was the underlying interest or the value that was the problem, that this is the thing that, this is the reaction that we're getting. So that's not necessarily a bad thing when that happens, though I mean, I don't like people to be upset. I'd prefer for people not to be upset. but sometimes you have to go through that to get to the other point. And I think we have to look at ourselves and figure out as much as possible, and I'll share this with the parties and ask them to do it, but as much as possible to figure out what are our triggers or our blind spots so that we're aware of them and we can attend to them when something comes up. And I find that a lot of people really know. I mean, they, you know, by the time you reach a certain age, enough people have told you what annoyed them about you. And so it doesn't come as a surprise to them generally. I mean, once in a while, I've had things come as a surprise to someone when you bring it up. They said, really, that's the problem? That's what they thought about me? But it doesn't come up that often. Generally, people kind of know. And so you can steer away from those areas, but you really have to know for yourself. And so using anger as an issue, a lot of us have a negative reaction to anger. And so if we do, and we choose to get into this kind of work, you got to know that that's a trigger and it's something that you have to work on. What do you do, Chuck?
Couldn't agree with you more. What I was thinking while you were saying that is the question of, are there special considerations and approaches that may be particularly helpful, useful, and appropriate in intergenerational or intercultural conflicts and communications? Troy, you teach it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so when I was a law student, there was I was in a classroom and something controversial was said, and the professor sort of just laughed it off. And you could kind of see in the classroom that people were really uncomfortable with it. And it sort of festered for the rest of the semester. And so the approach that I've taken, because we do deal with controversial issues all the time in law school, is that I will try to nip it in the bud as soon as it happens, right? And sort of get to what Elizabeth's saying, ask those underlying questions of, okay, why, explain more what you're trying to say. Because I don't think you were trying to say this, but what is it that you were trying to get at, right? Because law school, it's anxiety filled, stress filled. So sometimes students just blurt things out. And so the role that I think I play is sort of that mediator and moderator in that conversation. And it can be hard sometimes, but I think it's important to try to nip it in the bud as soon as it happens. Because if not, then it's going to fester and it's going to make the environment a place where students aren't going to feel comfortable participating.
I agree, because what I'm looking for is kernels of resentment. So is this something that somebody can let go, or is it something that, when I think of a kernel of resentment, I think of a popcorn kernel, and popcorn explodes when it's under pressure, and that little bit of water inside the popcorn makes it go from a kernel to one of my favorite snacks. And I think people are like that too. You reach a certain point and something becomes a kernel of resentment that you're not going to be able to get past. So Troy, while you were talking, I was thinking about wine, and generally wine gets better with age, but it can get to a point where it turns into vinegar. So some things, in my work, I think most things don't age better if they're a problem. And it's better to get it out on the table and to talk about it.
Thanks. We did want to leave a little bit of time at the end. We've got some great minds, thinkers on board here. If you folks have thoughts, questions, please keep them as succinct as possible so that we can give as many of you as would like to share thoughts as possible that opportunity. Julie, anything from your end?
I don't see anything else in the chat, but so far I've appreciated what you've said. Two things I wrote down for myself, just as kind of commentaries. I love that, Troy, you said all sides, because people often say two sides and really are both sides. And for complex issues, I always just balk at that. I don't think that's a good commentary. And then the other thing I'm seeing in the chat is, how do you handle this isn't quite, I'm not sure what this means. How do you handle a nonsense on lawyer?
Nonsense is a good word instead of BS.
Got it. A nonsense lawyer who came to mediation without preparation. Well, that's very specific.
Oh, I think that's for Chuck.
Okay.
Well, two things. First of all, I think all of us try to communicate with each side in advance of the mediation session itself, because Shakespeare was right. Ripeness is all. Readiness for resolution is an absolutely critical element. And Pelina, the relationship building aspects and skills and attributes are absolutely critically essential to that. So one is in your prep, try and smoke it out before it happens at the mediation, because by then it may be too late to make an effective correction. The other is when it comes up, if that leads to another session after more homework is done, that's okay. They may not need to solve it that day if they're not really ready to do that, because Elizabeth's exactly right. Party autonomy is sacrosanct. It has to be their solution to be enforceable, sustainable, and effective. Troy, any other last thoughts on the importance of Pilina weaving relationships in the work that you and we do?
I guess what I'll say sort of in closing is that we have to be really intentional, right, about creating those relationships, and that intention is something that you have to plan for in the classroom space, right? I plan these activities. I have to carve out time within my own curriculum to be able to do these sorts of activities. On the theory that that's going to help make our conversations better and more lively. To the same extent, I think as a mediator, you do have to think about the ways in which you can intentionally carve out ways to create that mutual respect and understanding. So thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Fantastic. Elizabeth, last thoughts on the role and value of relationship building and conflict resolution?
Sure, and I hope this also answers Porani's question as well. One of the things that I've found that really helps when I'm trying to work on a relationship is when I ask somebody to help me. And almost always people are willing to help. So Porani, I might have a conversation like that with the lawyer. And this would apply to anything else that I work on when I'd say, I really need your help here. You're such an important part of this. And I'm asking if we can work together on this. Can you help with this? And almost always people rise to that level. So I think if we set the scene, we can help people, bring out the best in themselves. And that's what we need to do too. Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice to see old friends here.
And thank you both. Hey, so for a final thought, maybe just think about, in conflict resolution, we don't have any intrinsic value. We are there to be a resource to the parties and to the people who assist and represent them. And if we maintain that value and set a tone of respect and understanding that honors not just the relationships that may have been damaged and may need to end or be restored and resolved, but those that they will need going forward for it to have meaning and value to them. Maybe we can be of service. Maybe we can be that resource. Julie, thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate what you shared. And one key takeaway I have for today is this idea of humanizing others. That is a a big takeaway for me today is how do we do that? Whether it's taking a minute before a meeting to go around and get to know each other better. I just did that at a board retreat that I attended. It was wonderful. I'd known these people for years and I learned things I'd never learned before. And we started that way and we had a much better meeting, I think, because of it. To, you know, the judgment versus observation. So it's all about how can we connect better to one another as human beings and respect each other and ask for that respect in turn. So thank you so much for you sharing your wisdom with us. And thank everyone here for coming today. Please do take a few minutes to fill out that survey. I've put it in the chat box a couple times. I'll do it again because it, you know, it moves up in there. Again, the survey does help with our grant funding. I will be sending out an email in the coming days with the video link, and we hope to see you next month when we have Tim Hansen speaking on Indigenous dispute resolution practices from around the world. Thank you to our presenters. Can we give them all a big Zoom virtual round of applause? And thank you for coming today. We appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Aloha.